Welcome, everybody. We'll kind of get started here. For those of you who don't know about Heartland, Heartland is a 33-year-old national think tank. We do things a little differently in that we don't focus really on national issues as much. We focus on state issues. So we have a government relations team that goes into each of the 50 states and works with the state legislators to try to get free market policies passed. Another thing we do is we actually send newspapers to every state elected official and actually federal elected official in the country every month. So over on our table on the left is a sample of our literature, but you'll see our newspapers over there: environment and climate news, budget and tax news, healthcare news, and my favorite, of course, is school reform news. But my take on it is this: if we don't fix the education system, none of the other issues will ever be fixed. So we've got to have an educated populace to take care of the rest of the issues as we go along. Over here to my left also is the Michael Perry Mazur Library. We started a library here collecting all sorts of volumes. We now have over 18,000 volumes here. During our workday, you're welcome to come in and visit and sit down, read any of the books we have, review anything there we have. We don't do checkout process. We are part of the Illinois rail system. So if you ever want to look up a book, they are on our website where you can look up the books, but anywhere in Illinois, any library, you can see what books we have as well too. So at this time, real quick, I'd like to introduce Tim Benson. He is our policy advisor in government relations, and he's going to come tell you a little bit about what government relations does.
Hello, everyone. As Lenny said, I'm Tim Benson. I'm a policy analyst here at the Heartland Institute with the Government Relations Department. And as he said just a couple seconds ago, Heartland is unique among think tanks in that we are a national organization focusing on state-level policy solutions for all 50 states. So our goal is to become the go-to resource for policymakers and to help educate state lawmakers about what they can learn from both the policy successes and failures from other states. So our full-time government relations team is really the spearhead of that plan. We are ready and willing to help lawmakers and staffers with any of their public policy needs. We do this by sending experts to testify before legislative committees. We have already testified in front of 12 different state committees this year. We host educational events like our Emerging Issues Forum, which our next one will be in Houston on November 7th and 9th. And by providing on-demand research from the top experts in the country on a wide variety of policy issues. Our education-related issues, we are working hard to encourage states to adopt or to roll back Blaine amendments, repeal and replace the Common Core state standards, and expand school choice programs such as education savings accounts, vouchers, and tax credit scholarships. Our latest release is a policy brief on ESAs called Education Savings Accounts, The Future of School Choice Has Arrived. You can find it and all of our pieces on school choice at our Center for Transforming Education website, www.heartland.org/education. And if you would like to learn more about any of our efforts on these or other issues, feel free to talk to me after the program. Thank you very much, and here's Lenny again.
Actually, Tim failed to mention, we actually have several of the ESA policy briefs on our table over here. We also have an education choice poster. Please feel free to pick them up. If there's not enough copies, let me know. I can go get you more copies. And we pass them out to your friends, your neighbors, your school board members, and your state legislators. Talk to them more about it. Real quick before our guests come up, in the back of the room, there's two products back there. The Educational Freedom Book is back there for sale, and also School Ink. These are products that came out of the Cato Institute and actually created by the lifelong process of Andrew Coulson, who passed away last year, which is kind of the discussion is tonight. We're going to talk about his ideas tonight with Neil McCluskey and with George Clues. George has a chapter in the book, so does Neil. So as our guests start coming up, I'll kind of tell you a little bit more about them. Neil is the director of the Cato Institute's Center for Education Freedom. He's helped put this book together that we'll discuss a little tonight to remember the late Andrew Coulson and all of his ideas and debating his ideas. So George is actually the founding editor of School Reform News. So back in 1995, when School Reform News started, George was the first editor. George has had several encounters over the years with Andrew, and he'll discuss three of those in particular. Also on the table, you'll see a handout there that George wanted everybody to have that's on your table tonight. So at this time, I will let Neil start, and he'll talk a little bit more about Andrew and the book, and then George will speak. Remember, if you have questions, go ahead and write them down, keep track of them, and at the end, you'll be able to ask questions as well.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to Heartland for having me this evening to talk about Andrew Coulson and our book about Andrew, as well as to talk a little bit about what was Andrew's kind of magnum opus, which was School Inc. You'll learn more about School Inc. as I talk, but both of them are in the back. And then, of course, there's this book, Educational Freedom, Remembering Andrew Coulson, Debating His Ideas. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in the book, but if you really want to know what's in the book, you got to read the book. So mainly I'm going to just give you sort of a basic outline of what Andrew was all about, who Andrew was, and then we'll talk about in more depth. George will certainly go into more depth on some of the issues that continue to be debated, even among libertarians, that Andrew had a lot to do with. And I want to thank George for joining us tonight and for his wonderful contribution to his book. As Lenny said, he has a chapter in here about the big burning debate about do you prefer vouchers, scholarship tax credits, a combination of those things. And as you just mentioned with the new policy brief, now you got to throw into the mix education savings accounts. And we had to do a spin on it at Cato where we have tax credit funded education savings accounts just to complicate things even further. So maybe we can discuss that. My delightful task, though, really this evening, is to tell you a bit about Andrew as a person, and then to talk about what I actually know best. I don't know Andrew as a person as well as I know his ideas, so I'm going to talk a lot about his ideas. Then George is going to weigh in on what maybe, is probably, I would say, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, maybe the second most burning issue among libertarians, among school choice people. There's another one I think is bigger, but that we probably agree on. I'll talk a little bit about that. And that greatest contribution, or second greatest contribution, I think, from Andrew, the first is just he is talking about school choice. He drove home the need for school choice and real educational freedom. The second thing that I'm going to say is probably his second biggest contribution is talking about tax credits. Scholarship tax credits is a way to deliver school choice. But his greatest accomplishment, absolutely, I think with no question, was making the case for basing education in freedom. And that's really important. So we talk about markets and free markets, and we talk about price and things like this. We should never lose sight of what's really important. It's education based in freedom, letting free people choose the education that's best for them. And that's not just about prices. It's not just about competition. It's about people with different norms and values and desires and goals for their children being able to access the education they think is best for them. And that's what Andrew was really ultimately about. And he sort of completely upended this orthodoxy that people seem to have, an assumption that people seem to have, that education has always and must always be provided by government, that somehow education is fundamentally different from so many other aspects of our lives, and that only education can provide it. So, again, I'm going to leave the second biggest accomplishment, this scholarship tax credit drive, to George to really dive into, and I'm going to focus on Andrew and his overall contributions to school choice. The drive for school choice and the drive for educational freedom. And I should say that while I knew kind of Andrew as a boss, and I got to know him as a person in a way, working with him as my boss, and he had many visits to the Cato home office in D.C., even though I got to know him, I'm really indebted to all the people who contributed to this book and to people who wrote really glowing tributes to Andrew upon his death. They gave me lots of insights into Andrew from their interactions. And sometimes it was debating with Andrew, sometimes they were inspired by Andrew, but I learned a lot about him by reading what other people had to say. And I also need to give big thanks to Jason Bedrick, who is the Center for Education, or Cato's Center for Educational Freedom's policy analyst for most of the time that we were working on this book. He's the co-editor of this book, and he did a whole lot of work to get this book out. And so lots of thanks is due to him. He is now at EdChoice as the policy or director of policy. You may know EdChoice by its old name, the Friedman Foundation, but there he's continuing to do really good work trying to get school choice in states around the country, but he really did invaluable work to get this book out. Now, Bob Bowden, who runs something called choicemedia.tv. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. But Bob Bound is essentially a one-man PR shop for the school choice movement. I mean, if you see a video or an article or anything about school choice, he might have had something to do with producing it. If not, he's made sure that everybody who possibly wants to see it can see it. Well, he kicks off the book with, I think, a really excellent kind of quick, concise chapter that lays out the basics of Andrew's life, and much more importantly, I think, kind of brings out the essence of who Andrew Coulson was, and that was kind of like a brilliant, almost supernaturally chipper and infinitely curious man who followed his passion to do what he thought was right. And that was to base education in the values and decisions of free people. And that chapter really brings that to life. But I'm going to do my best here just to establish sort of the factual basics and a little bit more insight into Andrew so that we all know a little bit about him even without reading the book. So Andrew was born in Montreal, Canada, to English-speaking parents. So you can already see why he might have had to have something of an independent streak. If you're an English speaker in Montreal, Canada, you've already got things sort of stacked against you. And he was also, no doubt, extremely technically oriented as a child. He would tell us stories when we'd see him about, usually at lunch, because we were working, but at lunch we could talk about family things. He talked about how much he enjoyed playing with computers and electronics when he was young, especially programming things with his brother Stuart. And it went far beyond anything I ever hoped to do. So I don't know how many of you, when you might have encountered computers first, but when I was about Andrew's age, probably about 10, when he started with computers and I started doing it, I was just amazed at how brilliant I was when I was able to take my Texas Instrument 99-4A. Does anyone remember the TI 99-4A? One of the first home computers. You stuck a cartridge in it. It had 16 kilobytes of memory. In any event, so I was able to program it where I would take asterisks and I could put them across in rows, and then I could do these statements where I could make the asterisks keep going down like this and have a black background and make the asterisk gold. And I was like, I'm going through space. And I thought that was just extraordinary what I was able to accomplish. Space doesn't usually just go like this. Well, Andrew at the same age was basically reprogramming his Macintosh computers with his brother. So that gives you a sense of how technically brilliant he was. And so what he ended up doing was then studying mathematics at the prestigious McGill University, so in Canada. And then he landed a job at really the hottest of the tech companies that you could imagine in the early to mid-1990s. Anyone know what that was? Anyone want to throw out a guess? What was the big tech company in the 1990s? Well, not Apple, Microsoft. He got into Microsoft really when the getting into Microsoft was good, at the very beginning. He was a software engineer in Microsoft in the 1990s. And if I recall correctly, what he told me he designed, and we're all indebted to him for this as well, was the recycle bin that is on your Windows operating system. And so anytime you recycle something on your computer, unless you're using a Mac, in which case you should thank someone else, but anytime you're using a Windows system and you recycle something, or even more importantly, think you have thrown out a document you need and then you discover that it's still in the recycle bin, you need to thank Andrew Coulson. It was at Microsoft that Andrew met his wife, Kay Coulson, but he didn't actually meet a job that he loved, even though he was very technically oriented, even though the hot place to be for tech guys at the time was Microsoft. His heart wasn't into his job, and he said to his boss, he said, look, I wish I loved the job as much as you do, but there are other things that I want to do. And so he did something that many people would think was kind of unimaginable at the time when Microsoft was so hot. He said, so long, Bill Gates, I'm resigning. He wasn't quite that rude about it, but he left Microsoft. And then he took up what ended up being his true passion, which was this drive to get school choice for people. And what really kind of clicked with him was he was astonished when the state of Oregon had an initiative just to get public school choice, inter-district choice, where you could go to elementary school in some other district, still public school, but in another district. And he thought, well, that'll be a no-brainer. I mean, who wouldn't think you should have more school choice, more ability to direct where your kids go to school? And then it got crushed. And he thought, this makes absolutely no sense. Why would the ability of people to choose where their kids go to school, and in this case, again, only among public schools, why would that be something people would vote against? And that really got him into school choice. This is what made him think, this is crazy and something needs to be done about it. So notably, Oregon was his southern neighbor. Boy, I should know my geography better. So Oregon was his southern neighbor because he actually stayed in Washington State. He said goodbye to Microsoft, but he stayed in Washington State. And he stayed in this idyllic town called Poulsbo. Maybe some of you know Poulsbo. I only know it from what he's told me. And it sounds like just a magical place. So he left Microsoft, but he didn't leave Washington because he loved Poulsbo. And he decided to take on this task of fighting for school choice all by himself. And the way he did it was, he did it the way that, people, libertarians, and people like me say is the right way to do it. Don't say, if I want to take on a problem, I'm going to go undertake a 6 or 7 year PhD program to maybe learn about the topic that I want to learn about. And by the way, I did that, and boy, what a waste it was. No, what he did, he said, there's a problem, and I'm going to go learn about it directly. I am going to research this myself. And that's what he did. He researched all about the history of education, how it's been delivered, what's the truth about how education be delivered, and that produced what ultimately put him on the education policy map, which was a book called Market Education, The Unknown History. And it laid out what many people thought of as the really shocking news, that now, this is news that even the hardest core supporters of public schools, they have to accept this reality. They may not talk about it. They may pretend it doesn't exist. But they can't say it's not true. And that for most of history, or much of history, education was delivered by the private sector. And when it was delivered by the private sector, it was much more effective than when government did it. And in his book, he lays out, whether you go back to classical Athens or colonial America or the early Republican period in America, it was private people, even for-profit entities that were delivering education and doing it with great success. And that's what this book laid out. And it was shocking to many people, but now we accept this as reality because it is reality. And with that book, Andrew established himself as sort of a school choice force. And I don't know how many of you know Jay Green. Jay Green is a great researcher at the University of Arkansas. And he talks about, and he writes about it in this book, about how he first met Andrew at an academic conference. And he's like, this guy's weird because he doesn't have a PhD. And oh, by the way, you should only be allowed to write about these things if you have a PhD. At least that was the thought. If you're not an academic, you couldn't possibly contribute to this topic. And he said, and he also brought his wife to this event, which also was strange because I guess people didn't bring their wives to these sorts of events. But he said, and he says in this book, Andrew really did what everybody should have been doing, which is looking at the history. Not just what are the test scores and fancy statistical manipulations, but looking at the history. And this book was so good, it first got Andrew employed at the Mackinac Institute, which many of you probably know in Michigan, and then at Cato. And this happened despite one non-negotiable thing for Andrew, which is that he would not leave Poulsbo, Washington. There was no job in the world that could get him to leave Poulsbo, Washington. And eventually both these think tanks said, fine, you can stay in Poulsbo, but what you have to contribute is so valuable, we are going to let you do that, even though it violates our policies. And I can tell you, in the case of Cato, those policies are pretty strict because I don't get to live somewhere other than Washington, D.C. But no, Andrew got to say, take that, nightmarish traffic of Washington, D.C., or whatever the traffic is like in Midland, Michigan, who knows. But he got to say, no, this will be on my terms that I get to stay here. And anybody who wanted to advance school choice said, that is fine. We wanted to get the best. Now, over time, Andrew became as much involved in pushing the school choice movement toward embracing true free markets. So not just saying, well, if we can get a program that maybe has 1,000 kids with a $1,000 voucher, that's great, and we'll declare victory. His point was to say, no, that's great if we can help low-income kids, but we're not really going to get what we need until we have a true free market for everyone, universal school choice. And that was what he spent probably 50% of his time on. The other 50% was telling all those people who said, oh, everybody should just go to public schools and there should be no school choice, why they were clearly wrong. And he succeeded, I think, in both those endeavors. You may have seen his chart, which was directed at those people who say we don't need school choice, but he has this chart where the spending goes like this. So it's like the space shuttle taking off or a rocket, and then you see the test scores over the same period, and they're like Death Valley. There's not a single movement. Well, maybe there's one little uptick, but then it's followed by a downtick. But otherwise, completely flat. Very clearly illustrating we're spending a ton and we're not getting anything for it. And you see that chart now a lot, all over the place. But he also, for the school choice community, laid out all the crippling effects of when you put big regulations on school choice. If you say, well, if you're going to participate in school choice, a school must give these tests, and you can only charge X amount, and you have to let every student in, and you can't remove any students. He made the argument of why that is wrong and why that doesn't help. And we are still, though, having that debate within school choice, how much accountability should be imposed from above. But I think his contributions move the ball in a serious direction away from this idea that you have to have lots of government control over school choice. And Andrew's writings were powerful, but his ultimate weapon was going to become popular media. People who know Andrew or know of Andrew may not expect this because he seemed very erudite. And he took the time to write a very big book about the whole history of education. So people wouldn't expect it, but he was an insatiable consumer of television shows and movies. And how he had the time to watch all the television shows and movies that he would tell me about, I do not have a clue. It's also interesting that in addition to being able to watch all these television shows and movies, every day he would get on his treadmill and run for I don't know how long, but play the ancient Chinese game of Go against people online from all around the world. So he's doing all these things and playing Go, which people tell me is extremely hard, which is why I've never gotten close enough to the game to learn how hard it is. But anyway, so when he was in town, and the Center for Educational Freedom gang, we'd go to lunch, he'd often regale us with, humorous scenes from shows and films from far and wide. So he liked things from the BBC, he liked stuff from America from the 1950s, he liked modern television shows, wherever and whenever he found stuff that he liked. And Bob Bowden notes in his chapter about Andrew that Andrew even saw the film Jackass 3 times in the theater. Now, probably none of you have seen Jackass because the title alone would say, I probably don't want to spend my time in that movie. But he saw that too, so he was really consuming everything. Well, School Inc., which is, again, his documentary, 3-part documentary, and the DVD is in the back, which is a project that Andrew worked on almost single-handedly. I mean, he did all he learned filmmaking, he learned how to negotiate with PBS, which is an incredible feat, because I had no idea how PBS worked, but you have got to grease a lot of palms to get anything done in PBS. Anyway, he worked through all of this on his own until he was diagnosed with brain cancer and then eventually passed away in February 2016. But what School Inc. did was it wedded his love of visual presentation and humor with his drive to explain how educational freedom works and how freedom just works in general. How do great ideas, innovative ideas, get taken to scale? That's really what this is about. And then to say we could do the same thing in education, and other people are getting closer to it than we are. In any event, years ago when School Inc. was just he was forming in his mind, he talked about melding sort of the wonder that he experienced when he watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I don't know how many people remember Cosmos, and then watching Free to Choose by Milton Friedman. And this was his idea, was to take his ideas and put them in a popular form that people wouldn't just understand, but they could feel. And that was how he was going to get the message across. And ultimately, he actually, Free to Choose Media, which of course is based in Free to Choose, Bob Chittister, they took over the project and really brought it to the finish line when Andrew was no longer able to do it himself. And then people may say, well, why put it on PBS, which of course is anathema to lots of libertarians, which I totally understand. But he was trying to reach not libertarians and not conservatives, but liberals and other people who don't read, unfortunately, what think tanks put out, but do watch PBS, and they think if it's PBS, it must be truthful. And that is why he aimed for the same thing that Free to Choose and Cosmos was on, is he wanted the people who aren't already in the tent to join us. And he wanted to put something very powerful together that helped them to do it. So School Inc. ran on PBS from April to June. It was different times at different stations around the country. And the question is, well, did it work? Was it persuasive to people? And it's very hard to tell because PBS doesn't track ratings. But what I can say is that at very least made some people who don't like school choice very nervous. Maybe nervous that this was reaching that target audience because Diane Ravitch, I don't know whether any of you know Diane Ravitch, but she was the erstwhile kind of defender of school choice for a little while, but now she's a rabid school choice opponent. And she condemned School Inc. And she condemned, in particular, PBS for showing School Inc. And in fact, a group that she's associated with put together basically a letter-writing campaign. And the letters weren't going to Cato saying, I think you got these policy parts wrong, or maybe your facts are wrong on this. No, this was a letter-writing campaign to PBS that said, and the initial letter said outright, if you plan to show this, remove it from your schedule. Now, I read that letter pretty fast, pretty early, and publicized, this sounds like censorship. Now, there's a lot we can talk about censorship, but when you say to PBS, remove this thing you're going to show, that sounds like censorship. And they did eventually remove that from the letter. I don't know how many form letters were sent out, but this was the nucleus of their plan was they set up a form letter to go right to PBS that said, we are outraged that you're showing this thing that dares to criticize public schooling, which ironically, it really didn't criticize public schooling. It said, here's a better way. And eventually they got rid of that letter, but they continued to condemn PBS for showing the documentary. And even the National Education Association, which is not just the biggest teachers union in the country, but the biggest union in total in the country, just at a couple of months ago at their national conference, passed a resolution condemning PBS for showing School Inc. So at the very least, we know the people who were most against school choice were very afraid that School Inc. was going to have this effect of taking people who may not have liked school choice and said, hey, this actually makes sense. And I know it makes sense because I saw it on PBS. Anyway, ultimately, a major reason that we put this book together is because, unfortunately, Andrew is no longer here to speak for himself. And we expected people to say lots of bad things about school choice, but we also expected people to see this documentary and say, I want to know more about Andrew Coulson. I want to know more about his ideas. And that's why this book is here. So people who watch School Inc. could quickly go somewhere and say, here's where I can find out more about Andrew and his ideas. And in here, we have a discussion, actually we have 3 chapters, on one of his core ideas, which was about, or I'll just say was, again, the center of one of the most heated debates. This is one of the debates within the school choice community, whether vouchers or tax credits are the best mechanism to deliver school choice. And I bet that George has a few things to say about that. So I am now going to cede the podium to George, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. I'm sure Andrew would be pleased to, would have been pleased to hear the news from Springfield, Illinois, that the Catholic Conference is working to put a scholarship tax credit program worth $100 million into Senate Bill 1 as part of the negotiations with Governor Rauner. That was, I read that on August 4th. Then just 3 days later, I read another headline, which was not entirely surprising, which said, Illinois Teacher Union opposes school voucher funding. They call tax credit vouchers, but it's the same program. But anyway, Andrew was a strong proponent of tax credits. First, I'd like to acknowledge Andrew's contribution to what I developed, which is a comprehensive menu of school choice options. It was his persistence in defending his views that prompted me to find ways of addressing the issues that he raised and defending them against his challenges. Now, he he can't challenge my latest proposals, but Jason Bedrick and Neil were very good editors in questioning a lot of the material that I initially put in the chapter. So they're following in Andrew's tradition. Andrew and I agreed on a central point. What is needed to improve the present K through 12 system of public schools is the creation of a vigorous education marketplace with different types of schools and education providers actively competing for students and for their tuition dollars. The difference we had was in how to do it. His approach was to focus on almost exclusively on the use of personal and scholarship tax credits, and with the use of vouchers being considered as kind of a fallback position. My position is to focus efforts primarily on universal vouchers, while also supporting a range of other school choice options, because different parents and different providers need different school choice vehicles for a variety of different reasons. I mean, parents may not want vouchers for a particular reason, and an education provider like the Catholic schools may not want to be involved in a voucher program. Well, I guess they can't. Most voucher programs they would not be involved in. But my approach is to say, well, we need lots of different options. Unfortunately, in most states, we don't have many options. Here in Illinois, we have charter schools and we have inter-district school choice. Believe it or not, the state does require each school district to provide parents with the option of allowing their children to go to another school within the district. That surprised me because my own experience and also with other parents is that it didn't seem to be the law according to the school districts. But anyway, Andrew and I first exchanged views back in 2004 when Andrew published the report Forging Consensus when he was at the Mackinac Center, which argued for the superiority of tax credits. I responded by writing a paper called No Consensus on School Choice. He responded by taking my arguments apart and posting it on the Mackinac Center website. We then again debated the different views in 2008 at a conference on the design of school choice programs at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. And thanks to the Cato Institute and Neil and Jason, we were able to continue the debate in the book Educational Freedom. One of the things that Andrew said was that education markets have consistently done a better job than state monopolies of serving both our individual needs and our community goals. Yet all market-inspired education reforms are not intrinsically or uniformly effective. They can succeed only to the extent that they support the conditions for a thriving education market and ensure that all families have access to that market. So then the question comes up, well, what are the conditions necessary for the emergence of a thriving education market that's accessible to all families? Now, I've got a handout, and when I put the handout together, I was thinking of doing a particular way of this presentation. Anyway, it turns out page 2 is the first one that I want to refer to, so if you, which addresses these issues, because Andrew, drawing from his own research, concluded that the conditions necessary for the effective operation of an education market are parental choice of school, having the parents have some direct financial responsibility for supporting the school, the freedom for educators to establish different kinds of schools, competition among educators, the profit motive for educators so that successful models, there's an incentive to replicate successful models, and for there to be universal access so that all students should be able to access. Now, what I did was look at this and said, well, I'm not sure that this provides the whole picture. Let's look at voucher programs, tax credit programs, and charter schools and say, well, let's look at actual experience, also things recommended by economists, and see if we can supplement this list. And so what I did was to add some items based on my own research and also on recommendations of economists to modify the last 4 items so that competition among educators needs to be explicit. It can't be sort of quiet in the background with the public schools not knowing about it. It's got to be out there. It's got to be publicized. The public schools have got to know about it. The funding has to follow the child because that provides the incentive to the public schools to say, well, we've lost funds as well as the student. We've got to do something about it, otherwise our business will continue to decline. The per pupil funding should be comparable to what the public schools spend. And about 75% appears to be a reasonable amount, like 75, 80%. The funding source needs to be reliable. There are a number of school choice programs, for example, the tax credit program in Florida. It involves 100,000 students. There are now $500 million in donations every year to those scholarship programs, but 80% of the schools are religious schools. There are very few private schools, and that's been the case for pretty much the history of the program. So there's no real incentive for private operators to come in and to replicate, because I think they look at the funding source and say, well, what are the limitations? How high can it go up? Is it going to last? And lastly, universal access. Now, where Andrew was concerned with having making sure that low-income students could have access to these choices, the proposals for extension of his tax credit idea by one of his colleagues have limitations to exclude high-income families from direct access to tax credits on their income tax to lower the cost for their own child, but also to deny them access to the tax credit scholarships. So they want the rich people to fund these scholarships, but they can't take advantage of them, and they're not going to have access to them, which to me seems all wrong, because universal access means everybody should have access, including well-off people. And if you look back at Milton Friedman's approach, his approach to what makes a free market work is that you need to have high-income families in the mix, because they're the ones that would support new ideas and more costly ideas. For example, you look at the history of videotapes players. I mean, initially they were very, very costly, and only rich people bought them. Now they've gone out of style and nobody uses them anymore because they've been replaced by something else that rich people initially supported. But what I also looked at was the programs that did appear successful in bringing about at least some aspects of a free market in education. And the closest we can get to that is with charter schools. Now, charter schools have lots of limitations, they have lots of regulations, but the key elements to the success of charter schools, in my mind, is that the per pupil funding is comparable to the public schools. The funding comes from a reliable source, and there is universal access. So the market is big enough for suppliers to say, well, yeah, there are a lot of regulations, but I think we can manage to make a go of this. And that's been the case with charter schools. Since 1992, almost 7,000 new charter schools have been created, and over 3 million students now attend charter schools. Many of them are one-off type charter schools, but there are a number of very large operations with for-profit operators of the schools and also a number of nonprofit operators like KIP. So that these three components are really very important. Now, with regard to regulation, I think I just want to make a point in that Andrew was concerned that vouchers attract significantly more regulatory encroachment than tax credits. I have to agree, looking at the research, that he's correct on that. When you look at what has happened in terms of the increase in regulation to voucher programs compared to tax credits, the voucher programs have attracted more. But I think what you need to look at is what kinds of regulations cause most harm to school choice programs. And everyone focuses on test scores and what curriculum needs to be followed. But the key, and it comes back to the items that I mentioned, number one is to give a maximum number of universal access and eligibility. If you have regulations that limit access and limit eligibility, as most voucher programs do, it's not going to be very successful. And also the voucher value is generally not very good. The one in Cleveland is pathetically low, and so in the whole city of Cleveland, I think there are only 6,000 students that attend voucher schools, which is about the same as it was at the turn of the century when it was a court case that went to the Supreme Court. The other problem with regulation of vouchers is that the regulations generally do not allow the voucher to be topped up. So the Cleveland one might be okay if the parents were allowed to top it up significantly. But usually the regulations say no, you have to take what the government is giving, and that's been a problem with the Milwaukee program, even though that is better funded than the one in Cleveland. Let's just switch quickly to the first page that I handed out. Say, well, if we're going to have a variety of school choice options, what would they be? And I've got 9 listed here. The first 4 are public school choice, which is choice just involving public schools. The traditional local public school, and then intra-district choice, which is allowed in 21 states. Inter-district choice, where you're allowed to send your child to a school outside of your district with no financial penalty. That is operating in 23 states. And I mentioned charter schools. Charter schools are not authorized in all states, but as I said, they serve over 3 million students currently. Private school vouchers, they currently serve around 250,000 students across the country in various programs. Education savings accounts are relatively new. They've only been around a few years. I think there are only probably 5,000 or 6,000 students involved. Special education vouchers they've been approved in a number of states. The most popular one and the biggest one is in Florida, where there are over 10,000 students in the McKay special education program. And then scholarships funded by tax credits. I'd already mentioned the one in Florida, which is the largest with over 100,000 students. And that can probably grow to around $2 billion. So it can grow 4-fold before it reaches the limit of tax credits that can be applied to the sources that are available. So the corporate income tax and some insurance taxes that are about $3 billion a year comes into the state from those sources. But with diminishing return, what the scholarship funding organizations have to do is find the people who pay those taxes and persuade them to donate the money to the scholarship organization. They've obviously got the big ones, so at some point they're going to find it's not cost effective to go after more and more, and my own estimate is that that will probably be around $2 billion. And then finally, number 9, individual income and property tax credits for educational expenses. Property tax credits don't exist anywhere yet in the country. every other option that is mentioned on this page is in effect somewhere in the country. But the individual income tax credits that are in place, 471,000 families across the country take advantage of those. And what those do is reduce the cost of education to the family. I'm running out of time, but the point I wanted to make here was that what is the objective of the school choice program? I mean, we talked earlier, we want to reform the public schools. If you give a family a tax credit, let's say, and it's worth maybe $500 or $1,000 to families across the state, that's not likely for the public schools to say, oh, we'd better clean up our act and do a better job, otherwise we're going to lose a lot of students. So basically, the individual income tax credit is basically a rescue operation. It allows students to be retrieved from situations that are not satisfactory, or it allows parents to keep their children in a private school. But it's unlikely to reform the public schools. And if you look at a private voucher program, and let's dream and say it's universal access, it's 75% of the public school funding, and parents can top it up. The voucher is drawn against existing education funding. That would certainly wake up the public schools, and that would become a reform operation. And if you look at each of these options, you can say, well, this is how it does for rescue, and essentially all of these programs serve as rescue operations. They can all help children to get children out of failing schools, but not all of them will reform the public schools. And since I'm run out of time, I'll call it quits there. Thank you.
For many of you who've been here before, when we do Q&A, we'll have two gentlemen with microphones. Wait till the microphone is at you before you ask your question. Anybody online, please write your question down, and somebody will also get that to us as well. Our first question will be right here in the back with Jim.
Why should people who don't have children pay for the education of children of other people?
Whoever wants to go first.
Do I need to turn this on, or?
Yeah, I turned it on already. There, okay.
With regard to, if you look at families, then you can say, well, middle income families and upper income families will certainly educate their children. Lower income families will have a much more difficult time to get a good education for their children, although there is a significant demand for that education, as James Tooley has shown with his studies in India, where poor families are willing to pay a lot of money in terms of their income for a better education for their child. But I think here in the United States, I think there's a public benefit of everyone being educated. I think we should, my own personal preference would be to leave education by and large to the parents, but then certainly have some kind of program where lower income families could get scholarships and so on to get a good education, because I look at my own education back in England when most kids left school at 16 unless they passed an exam to go to a selective grammar school. And I passed the exam, and quite frankly, it changed my life because if I hadn't passed the exam, I probably would have ended up working for my father on a farm because it was the easy thing to do, and it was hard work. But I think for students or families that don't have the ability, I think we need to help them because as we've seen, the costs of poor education are very great. If we look at the city of Chicago and what's happening to the students who don't graduate from the Chicago public schools, we have a real problem.
Well, I'll give 3 answers. I think part of my job here is to sort of channel what Andrew would say. So I'll tell you what I know was his position on this, but I'll start by saying that the big argument for why people without kids should pay for people with kids is that there are all these sort of spillover effects. When Milton Friedman wrote about it, he called neighborhood effects, to say, well, if everybody's educated, it's not just that they benefit because they get a better job, but somebody who's educated also will vote more and they're less likely to go to jail and all sorts of things like this. I actually think that's a very dubious argument because people have a self-interest in getting educated and will get educated and those other things will go with it just based on their self-interest. And Friedman actually changed his mind about neighborhood effects as time went on. But that's sort of the classic argument. I think Andrew actually thought that there would always be some role for government to supply funding, but only for those really poor families who may not really be able to afford education. And I think he thought that would still be a pretty small amount because we've seen with Tooley's work that the poorest people in the world are prepared to spend a relatively large sum of their own money to get the best education they can for kids. But Andrew, from what I talked to him about this, thought there would probably always be some need for a safety net. I'm a little even more radical maybe than that, in that I imagine that there will be some people who will have difficulty affording education if it were totally free market, but that's what civil society is for, and civil society would do a much better job of helping people who couldn't afford education to get it. And that's what we kind of saw in the colonial period and the early Republican period, was education wasn't free, but towns would take up money to help those people who couldn't pay their own bill so that they could pay it. So, and then when civil society does it, you don't have all the huge problems that come with government getting involved, building up natural special interests who are getting that money, who then lobby more and more to get more money, and all the really bad stuff that follows that.
Okay, next question will be over here, but make sure you raise your hand long enough for one of the people with the mic to come over to you so we know where the next question is going to be, because we are actually recording that as well. So.
One of the arguments that pro-choice opponents always come up with is that once the better motivated kids leave the public schools, what's left is a core of very difficult children to deal with that nobody else wants. How would you respond to that?
Well, there is a way of funding that, and some districts actually have funded it in that there's a concept called weighted student funding, and the idea behind this is that not all students are equal in terms of ease of education. There are certain characteristics of students, for example, low income, English language learner, and other characteristics that make it more difficult to educate the student. And so the idea is then to allocate more funds to that student relative to the average student. And that was first done in the Edmonton School District under a superintendent named Strembitsky, who is an unsung hero of mine, who put this in effect and essentially created a public school choice program within the district so that the schools then could specialize, and the schools specialized and drew the students that they could educate. The ones that were harder to educate brought more funds. The funds were then under the control of the principal of the school, and so the school district, it worked out very well for everyone. The parents were very happy with it, and I think a similar kind of thing could be done with the issue that you raised too.
I like that I can delay and then you'll answer, and then I can take the time to write down my thoughts so I don't sound like a blithering idiot. No, that's not what I meant, because
No, that's
Okay, see now already, whenever I'm allowed to talk, I just step into all sorts of things I shouldn't. No, it's only me who would sound like a blithering idiot. You sound like a blithering genius. Anyway, so, but it does give me, I can write down little lists for myself so that it's a lot easier. Anyway, there's several answers to that. I think the first one is that we should remember, and you talked about it, I think, when you're talking about maybe videotapes and things like that. What we see in other parts of the economy is there will be very highly motivated people who are interested in all sorts of different things. And they actually serve a purpose in that they'll vet stuff for the people who aren't as interested. And they'll be the first ones to buy it, and they'll pay a lot of money for it, and they'll say this is good and this is no good. And so that's why, to buy a car, I don't know anything about cars, but I don't have to be a genius in cars because there are people who are highly motivated to vet them, and they can make money by publishing Road and Track and stuff like that, so that, again, blithering idiots like me can find a car that's good. I think another thing that we see is, I think there's a tendency to assume that most parents wouldn't become educated consumers because they're not right now. But it's totally rational for most parents not to be educated consumers right now because there's nothing they could do with a knowledge of better schools anyway, because they don't have school choice. And what we've seen with school choice programs is at least the people who access the choice become much savvier consumers as time goes on. But then there's this last kind of straw man, not really straw man, but a concern that people have when they say, well, there'll be those parents who aren't prepared to make a decision for their kids. And they'll even say, well, some just won't do it. If you have parents who are so dropped out of a child's life that they won't make a choice for their child, the problem is something that exists and is rooted outside of the school. And I think that everybody who talks about school choice, it's education policy, school choice people, public school aficionados, everybody, we have a tendency to say, well, the school must be good or bad based on its test scores. And certainly the school has an influence. But much of what affects a kid's test scores and how they do in school is not something the school controls. So we also have to say, if a parent is so dropped out that they won't make a choice, that probably the intervention needs to happen before a child even gets to school, because they have much deeper problems than the education system can fix, and that exist before the education system's even involved.
I'd just like to add to that, because Neil's comments reminded me of another issue, and that is school choice transforms the parents as well as the child. I'm not sure if anyone here remembers, but Virginia Walden Ford was in town probably got to be 8 or 9 years ago now. I remember it was Maggiano's, I think on Rush Street. And she was talking, she got a question about the DC voucher program. And she said, well, she remembers one parent who was desperate to get his daughter into the program. But she said they were a little leery of him because they were doing the recruiting in a really not a very good area of town, and it looked like he may have been on something. Anyway, he had difficulty getting his act together, but he did get his daughter ultimately registered. And then about a year later, they were having a reception for parents, and Virginia Walden's Ford's sister comes over to her and said, "Hey girl, have you seen so-and-so?" She said, "No, who's that?" And she didn't recognize the guy. It was the same guy who had been on something when he signed his daughter up. She said he had completely turned his life around. And she made the comment that they'd noticed that with other parents too. Being able to do something for their child really empowered the parents. And I think it's Jack Coons who makes a big issue about that with regard to school choice being a family policy. It's good for the family because it helps parents work in the best interests and make decisions in the best interests of their children, rather than having to say, well, I really can't do anything. I know your teacher isn't very good and the school's not very good and you're getting bullied, but the school won't do anything.
Next question's over here, then we'll come to the front.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. This is a very important topic, and thank you, Heartland, for sponsoring it. I have many concerns. One is the black community benefits from charter schools and school choice, yet they vote for candidates, overwhelmingly candidates that don't support their position. Then there are minority groups like the NAACP that I joined one time that strongly oppose charter schools because the teachers union got after them. How can we do a better job of winning black voters on this issue? That's one question. And related, too many parents with kids in public schools are not involved. They don't go to the PTA. They're clueless, while the teachers union are very, very active, as we know. Most Democrat legislators, and my legislator, if I sat here, would probably support charter schools, but they're not going to do it in the legislature because they get their contribution for their campaign from the teachers union. So how do we do a better job of reaching people, educating them? I don't know, do we hold meetings at the college community meetings or the community or the colleges? How do we get this message out?
I'll go first to prove that I'll be a blithering idiot because you didn't give me time to figure everything out. And these are actually topics that I wish I had better answers for, because sort of the big mystery is, how do we come up with a messaging strategy that really moves the ball on school choice? The good news is we actually have made a lot of progress on school choice. It never sounds like it, because if you look from day to day, you feel like we're not getting anywhere. But remember, in 1989, there was no charter schooling, no modern voucher programs, no tax credit programs. And now we have millions of people in charter schools, about less than 500,000, but close to 500,000 in school choice through some sort of private school choice program. So we've actually made a lot of progress, and people now think they at least assume they should have school choice. It's interesting, the question about how do you get African American voters to vote on this issue. This is one of the fundamental problems with doing things through government, is when you vote for someone, you're voting on myriad issues, and you can't easily say, I want you to do do this on this and that and this and this and that, and I'm voting for you on these 5 issues and not these 6. And it is very clear that African Americans want school choice. I mean, the polling has shown that over and over. I just wrote a blog post about this when people said, oh, well, you don't know that. Well, yeah, we do. African Americans definitely want this, but it is really hard to separate it from all sorts of other issues where they're not aligned with a lot of the politicians who would like school choice. That said, school choice is not an issue that breaks traditional liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat fissures. You can go to, we were talking about Texas earlier. You think Texas is a rock rib Republican state. They can't pass private school choice to save their lives. They try every year, and it always fails. And the opposition is really from Republicans, rural Republicans, suburban Republicans. And that's really the group we got to meet or sway, is kind of those rural people, but also suburbanites, who say, I've got a good school. My public school does fine. Why would you need anything other than a public school? I went to public school, my kids go to public school, and they don't recognize that they themselves exercise school choice, but they did it by buying a house. Maybe the message is, what an absurd way to pay tuition is you have to buy a $500,000 house to get into a good school. But George, I hope you know the answer to this, because I have not hit upon the magical messaging that's going to move either African American voters to demand more school choice and make that a key issue, or reach people in public schools.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the answer either. I look at voting results and I shake my head and think, how can they possibly vote for this candidate when all they do is vote against the very thing that they want for their children? And I really don't have the answer either, because the thing that kept me going with School Reform News, every month we'd put out this issue, and I'd say, here's some news, here's some headlines, this is really going to turn things around. And so I'd send that issue out, I'd be really positive, and then it's like, well, didn't have quite the impact. Next month. But I still don't have the answer, unfortunately.
I'll just add one thing. You know what may have helped is the Common Core, and that actually got a lot of suburbanites at least angry about the idea that some central government was going to tell them what they were going to learn and that their kids would have to be tested. That certainly didn't drive lots of people to school choice, but it did help make people angry at the public school system, and a lot of people who otherwise probably would have been helpful or are happy with it. So maybe that sort of thing helps.
Okay, question right here.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question to his question, and that is, theoretically, school reform in this way should lead to an improvement in the schools. Doesn't it also lead to an improvement in the worst schools where the kids whose parents don't care have been left behind? Doesn't it force either an improvement in the school itself or maybe force the closure of that school, leading to the parent having to move the kid to some other school? I mean, is this supposed, there are, what, 1.5 million people on vouchers or tax credits at this point in the country? Have there been any studies done to show that there's actually, other than isolated charter schools and magnet schools where there has been improvement because of focus, has it done anything beneficial to an entire district?
Yeah, and see, this is why I should write everything down, because I can't believe I didn't make that point, because we were actually talking about this before we started. There was a study that came out just a few days ago that said, this was about charter schools, that said that the traditional public schools in the vicinity of charter schools got better because they recognized they had competition and had to react to it. And that's been a fairly consistent finding when people have looked at it for private school choice, is that the public schools that are immediately affected by people being able to choose another school actually do get better. It's not like they're suddenly every child is proficient where before they were illiterate, but there have definitely been, statistically significant findings of improvement.
And I think with regard to, the schools that are left behind, that just, if you look at the migration from the city, from Chicago and other major cities, you look at the decline in the size of the school districts, and with essentially parents moving their families to the suburbs where there are better schools. Did it create an improvement in the city schools? I don't think anyone knows. So they lost hundreds of thousands of students, and schools became small, and not enough students to keep them going, but then there were fights to keep those schools open, and we see that in Chicago, where the mayor is trying to close schools that are clearly too small to be functional or to pay operationally, and wants to close them.
Well, those original moves were geographical in a big way. People moved 30 miles.
Yeah.
I'm kind of asking, if somebody's going to only move 3 miles just to get to a better school, won't that improve ultimately that school they left behind? Within the district.
Well, that's I'm not up to date completely on what happened in the Edmonton district, but I gather those effects did take place. But even with regard to the comments I made about the Florida tax credit program, it's a large program. It's spread out all across the state, but studies have shown that in areas where you have a compact enough area with the private schools and the public schools, you can see an improvement in a small improvement in the quality of the public schools with regard to their test scores, which unfortunately is how we have to measure it.
We talk about a district, and I don't think there's a whole lot of district level stuff, but I will say that the District of Columbia, actually, DC public schools are still terrible. They still cost a ton, but they've actually gotten better than they were. And there were some massive reforms under Michelle Rhee, and I think a major driver of that was that district was hemorrhaging students. Part of it was people could move to Maryland or Virginia, but they did sort of force charter schooling in there and private schools. Now about 45% of kids are going to charter schools, and the ability of people to leave either for other states or for these schools seems to have been an impetus for the DC public schools to get its act together much more than they had it together in the 80s and 90s. Not that that's anything amazing, but it was still a noticeable improvement in DC, and I think that people being able to leave had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, and actually, Jay Green did one of his studies on Milwaukee actually showed that where the kids that left improved, but the kids that stayed and didn't get into the choice program, that district schools did improve as well too. So those studies are out there.
And
So-
just to back up Neil's point, the Temple study you just referred to
Yep.
about New York City with the charters, it showed that the closer the charter was to a public school, the better the students did. If the charter school was co-located in the same building as the public school, traditional public school, the students performed even better than they did if the school was just located a few blocks nearby or half a mile nearby.
Yep.
One more question.
Just a brief one. I've noticed a lot of our schools is like one size fits all, and they're starting to do things that traditionally weren't even done by the schools. We've got character counts. They're now serving hot lunches to the kids. There's breakfast available before school in some of our schools. And I'm wondering, I noticed personally the kids whose parents are really involved are the ones who do well. And as the schools are starting to take over more and more what should have been done by the parents, is this causing a negative effect on our kids? And what do we do to kind of back off the schools and say, no, you shouldn't be doing what the parents are supposed to be doing?
Well, I tend to agree with you in that my wife and I were talking about the same kind of thing where I forget which district it was now providing hot breakfasts for all students because they didn't want to embarrass the students, certain students. And I think it's the same thing with paying for hot lunches. Some parents don't pay for those. And so the district is supposed then not to serve the student. But now they put in a program that says, well, no, you can't shame the child. You have to give that child some food, whether the parent is paid or not. And I said, well, the government is just way, way too involved in family lives. The government is making too many decisions that we ought to be leaving to parents. And when the government makes those decisions, the parents tend to think, oh, well, it's taken care of. Some parents tend to think, well, it's taken care of. I don't need to do that.
I just want to focus a little bit on the character counts that you talked about, because that's really important, and it goes to something that Andrew was really concerned about and that I'm really concerned about, that has nothing really to do with test scores. It doesn't have to do with the price of education. It's not about free markets per se. But that's one of the effects of having a school system where one set of schools is supposed to serve all people, is that not all people have the same values. We don't have the same moral values, political values. We don't agree on history, all sorts of things that we fight about because we don't agree on them because we're diverse people. And what happens in public schools is either you have the fight and one side loses, or, and we see this often in public schools, is we just avoid a topic that people disagree on. And for a while, when we were a more homogeneous country, the public schools were de facto Protestant institutions that were teaching kind of Protestant values. And yes, there was lots of disagreement about that. But because you had sort of this homogeneity, you could have some values taught. We became much more diverse. The schools, nobody agrees on these values, because the nature of the public schools is they cannot serve diverse people equally, but they try. Character counts is an effort to try and make up for kind of the moral teaching that a lot of people would choose in the schools if they could, but they can't because you can't agree on these things in public schools. So one value of school choice is, instead of saying everybody pays for a single system of public schools and you fight over what is taught, you instead choose schools that share your values so you can get coherent values taught that you want. And then you don't need to do something like milquetoast character counts, which most people don't like and disagree with and say doesn't really teach much. And you could have people getting what they wanted from the schools and teaching really rigorous moral values, whatever those moral values are that you think are important as a family.
Okay, one more.
Years ago, on the Capitol steps in Washington, I helped launch character counts with Tom Selleck.
I hope I didn't insult you or Tom Selleck.
So we have one more question over here. I noticed there are some other questions. I'm sure Neil and George will be around afterwards that you can ask questions then, but I have one final question right back here.
So I come from technically a very good school district by test scores, and there's, Charles Murray had a lot of literature about IQs being dumped into zip codes. So this could be one issue with suburbanites overestimating the value of their school systems. Is there a better way, and what are they, to evaluate a school system than just using test scores or test scores improvements?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. So definitely people overestimate the value, I think, of their schools. The way we make people not overestimate the value of something is make them pay with their own money. And we don't really do that in public schools. Yes, I mean, you pay taxes, but you don't really make a direct connection. I paid X in taxes for this school. It's not like when you go to the school, you say, I'm writing you a check. And so we have a huge disconnect between what people are paying and what they're demanding. And of course, you have sort of the people without kids who are also paying for this. If you really want people to take a long, hard look at the value of what they're getting, they have to pay for it directly. And school choice is a way to get at that. But it's also important, as George talked about and Andrew talked about, you also have to use some of your own money for that. I do worry that if we had a total voucher system, which would also include if somebody's full freight for a school were paid through someone else's, donation they got a tax credit for, that people wouldn't feel that investment. That's why it's so important that people who are selecting the school, even if they're getting a voucher, that they pay something. That's how you make people care about the value, is they're the ones who pay the bill for it. All right.
Let's give Neil and George a round of applause. Before you go tonight, I want you to remind you on your table, there's a flyer for some upcoming events here at Heartland. Next week's event is creating the Declaration of Independence. You want to learn a little bit of history, next week's the week to come out. And on September 8th and 9th, we're actually having a picnic here where you can come meet our new president and continue to talk to Joe, our CEO, outgoing CEO, and talk to him about all the work he's done over the years. And Joe has been really, really involved in school choice efforts the whole time he's been here at Heartland. But please come out. Actually, for your summer gear, you should think about buying one of our t-shirts over here for $10 to wear to our Picnic for Freedom. So in the back, also reminder, $5 each. You can buy the book Educational Freedom, or you can buy School Inc. I highly recommend them both. If you have I just watched School Inc. myself not long ago. I missed it when it was on PBS, but I did watch it. And it is great. It tells you what's going on in the world, the innovation that's happening around the world, and some of the history of education and how private education was working before the takeover by all the public schools. You'll get some of that history in School Inc. And it's great to see. So they're only $5 each. And please, if you have more questions, you can talk to Neil and George about it. And there's a dip jar in the back. If you'd like to donate to Heartland, just dip your credit card in. And we appreciate that. We try to have as many guests in here as we can, and the more you help, the more we can get more guests in, the more we can actually do more publications that we can give to you, that you can pass out to your friends and neighbors, take them to your school boards, take them to your schools. And so I just want to thank you all for coming tonight, and let's one more round of applause for George and Neil.